Welcome to the STEM Equity web-based package. I am Dr. Stephanie Garcia, an Education Associate at IDRA. Welcome to Chapter 2, where I'll take you on a brief virtual data walk to help set the stage for discussions taking place in the next 2 video chapters. A couple topics that we'll read today. One, we'll start off with just some general STEM data. And then we will go into more, taking that funnel top-down approach. We'll start to look at gender disparities within STEM education and workforce, as well as really honing in on computer science being one area of concern. And then finishing with some recommendations to support your own data collection and analysis to get informed and take action in your region. First, we will review current research and data to unpack the landscape of STEM education regarding racial and gender diversity. I think it's important to launch the discussion, though, in this way. First, why STEM? Let's stop for a moment to think about the importance of STEM and use this to help frame the data walk today. Taking a look here at the screen, here's some really great things I found within the Texas Education Agency STEM Family Toolkit. And so here, it's got a great list of ideas to really answer that question of why STEM. Right? It prepares children for an ever-changing world, develops 21st century skills, builds grit. It's challenging, especially the coursework for the hard math and sciences. But we know that the STEM fields are ever growing in demand and they pay more. STEM inspires innovators, inventions for the future. It improves our world. My nephew once said, STEM does good in the world. He knew right away of how great, with technological advances in medicine and all the useful ways we use technology in our everyday society. And a lot of students can say, hey, STEM's fun, and that's great. There's lots of fun things to do in STEM as well, and that's important to mention. Now, looking at the racial demographics across the United States, I definitely want to focus more on the states within the IDRA EAC South region. But before we kind of zoom in on the South, let's take a note of the color-coded key up here, right? So in this kind of light orange, we have white, and the lighter blue, black, the darker orange, Hispanic, kind of the brownish color here is Asian, and the dark blue represents multiple races, the pink representing mainly over here a little bit more. We can see some American Native, Alaska Native, and then green, which are smaller numbers here. You'll notate the numbers on the side of these squares. There's the Native Hawaiian. So you can see here already, we've got some states in the EAC South region, West Virginia, Virginia, but let's take a look a little bit lower. And, let's pause the video and find your state's data and consider how this general makeup in your state is also reflected in your schools, right? So taking a look here at Texas, we can see here that we have mostly Latino here, and we can see similar demographics in California. We know that HSIs make up most of Texas and California universities. Also looking at Louisiana, big difference than Texas, and Louisiana is our neighbor, right? Looking at Tennessee, we've got Carolinas, Virginias, we've got Georgia and Florida as well, pretty comparable. And so this data is really helpful as we think about this next compelling image. So here, this is a summary of the entire United States. But what's interesting that they've done here is they've projected the race ethnicity breakdown for the next 40 years or so. And so we can see the proportions, here's the color-coded key again within this graph, but we can see the proportions dramatically changing, right? And so for many of us in the South, we're already a majority minority serving state, right? So our community is reflected in that way, our schools are reflected in that way as well. But I think it's really interesting to see how these numbers will only grow and increase in the coming years. And I think that's important to just notate. And as we're doing this data walk, and as we start to channel in on schools a little bit more. Obviously it's important to note that there are significant gaps and racial representation and major disparities, gender disparities that have to be addressed early on in K-12 education, and STEM education in particular. If these are not addressed, these same inequities are just going to persist in the STEM workforce, especially when you're channeling in on college degrees and first generation students entering and finishing and persisting through these courses and attaining the degrees for the careers, right? So it's important to notate some of these things here listed on the screen. And we'll dive through each of these a little bit more throughout this data walk. So this is a great snapshot provided by Pew Research Center. In 2019, Latino adults made up only 8% of STEM workers and only 8% in computer jobs. Black adults comprised only 9% of STEM workers and only 7% of computer science occupations. In contrast, white workers made up 62% in computer science jobs. So these gaps are reflected in tech companies, right? When you look at Google's workforce or Apple's workforce, we can see very small numbers of Black or Latino employees within those major tech companies. So it's a real problem that we're facing here. Another, looking at gender disparities, right? Also echoing, especially women of color, right? We're seeing that women in STEM occupations tend to earn less than their counterparts, their male counterparts. So in 2019, the median earnings of women in these occupations was $66,200, which is 74% of the men's earnings. That's a major disparity, and that's really thought-provoking as we're really thinking about supporting women in STEM. This has to come up in our discussions, right? Latino and Black women who earn an average of $57,000 in 2019, were the highest paid demographics versus the highest paid demographics of Asian and white men who earned $103,000 average amount of salary there. So that's like almost half of what their counterparts are making. So this is a huge issue that needs to be addressed. And I'm really grateful for all the research that Pew Research has been sharing around this. And we really need to share this amongst our networks. So now as we kind of funnel down and transition from national data to STEM workforce data, and now I'd really like to make the case for this statement here. This STEM pipeline and these issues of equity, these begin early on. And so we need to kind of turn our focus to our discussion here and really think about what kind of efforts we need to really improve upon here in the STEM pipeline, early on in the STEM pipeline. Quick question, does your state have an endorsement plan for students? So here in Texas, House Bill 5 says, hey, all 8th graders in Texas need to select an endorsement or pathway that determines their high school coursework and experiences. That's a big decision, right? First of all, so we could take many sides of this discussion, but I thought that this graphic was really compelling because I actually was an in-class middle school 8th grade science teacher during this time. And looking at the 2017-18 school year, that is the first cohort of students of 8th graders selecting the endorsement. And what's really interesting here is out of all these endorsements, as they progress through their 4 high school years to graduation senior year, only 1/3 of these students who selected the STEM endorsement graduated with that endorsement. So we see a staggeringly low decline here on a graph, right? But then as we see a fall in that line in a graph, we're seeing a rise in the number of STEM openings predicted in 2026. We can see here 1.9 million openings. So the demand is high, right? But are we getting our students prepared for this, right? And I just want to note that educators and counselors play a crucial role in terms of guidance, for students in selecting STEM coursework, and families too. Did you know that 73% of students said that their parent had some influence on their decision to study STEM? So parents and counselors, educators, collectively, we need to come together and figure out how can we support our students in STEM, not just to the STEM pipeline, but persisting through that STEM pipeline. So as with all achievement gaps, the diversity gap begins with the socio and economic disparities. Children do not come to school with equal advantages. Thus, it shouldn't be a surprise that the diversity gap in computer science and college and careers continues through K-12 schools. So it's happening in computer science, it's happening in STEM fields in general. So let's take a stop and let's review some more data tools to help really paint the picture here of the gender disparities in particular that exist within STEM education and their workforce. I'm going to highlight 3 different ones here. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for a second so that we can, or actually I'm not going to stop sharing. I'm just going to minimize this to take a quick look here at the gender disparities. Now, before I do, I want to point out, as we're talking about pipeline issues, right? We have a whole other STEM web-based package around college readiness, but because it overlaps with math education and that pipeline issue, I want to take a second to review how AP courses are strong indicators, but also there's 2 really big gatekeeper courses here. When we're looking at middle school and pipeline issues, algebra in the 8th grade is a big gatekeeper for students persisting through advanced math courses to be college ready, and then calculus being that indicator in their senior year in high school. So I'm not going to go over this entire graphic, but I wanted to show you this graphic here about the college prep math course sequence and how it begins in middle school. So when we're talking about students being college ready and persisting through the STEM pipeline, we have to talk about earlier on here in the middle school, actually. So I just wanted to take a second to highlight this and, also highlight, as we'll talk about in the next video chapter, we'll talk about some barriers in the STEM pipeline. Sometimes students are tracked out early on, and that's a major pipeline issue as well. As we think about the amount of students are graduating among your states, I know this is very Texas specific, but as we think about all of your high school graduates going into college, are they college ready? Have they been set up for success? Do they have those high expectations of them to take the coursework needed to persist with whatever future they decide in, right? So this is something really, really important. So tracking, we'll talk about that in the next video chapter. We'll talk about different systemic barriers that happen. But I just wanted to highlight that IDRA has a ton of resources to help illuminate some of these disparities and help inform us of what courses of action we need to take. So going back to looking at advancing women and girls in STEM and looking at the gender disparities within STEM education and workforce, National Growth Collaborative Project is doing amazing work. And every year they have this amazing report that they publish. And so I just wanted to highlight some pieces as this is a significant data tool in this discussion. I love how they started off here that girls and young women and boys and young men do not significantly differ in their abilities in math and science. It's not an ability issue. It's very much so a belonging issue, right? When we think about their interest in STEM, their confidence in STEM, their sense of belonging in STEM, these are major issues to think about within this discussion, right? These numbers have meanings behind it, right? And so we know that girls and young women, they're actually on par, right, with boys and men. So we got to get rid of and ditch those deficit narratives around young women and their participation and performance in math and science because they're doing great. The issue here is the levels of participation or enrollment starts to change when we start to look at courses like computer science, engineering, and physics, and those degrees as well. So thinking about women earning their degrees and how they change and how they're shifting, and we start to see these emergences here of, gender disparities as well as in the workforce, how women continue to remain underrepresented in the science and engineering workforce. Looking here, especially, I wanted to come down here as we look at our women of color, right? Latina, Black, and Indigenous women continue to be underrepresented in STEM, but they are gradually increasing their share of STEM degrees. So amazing work here. We've got to take a look at this though, because less than 10% of them are making up the STEM workforce. So Women in STEM, smaller number. Women of color in STEM, even smaller, right? So me holding a PhD, right, a doctorate degree, I'm like one of 2%, I think. I'm Latinos make up 2% that hold doctoral degrees. So this is staggeringly low, right? These numbers really hit home for myself as a Latina STEM educator, right? So going back though, to our discussion here about gender disparities in STEM, I'd like to continue, we will talk more and more about barriers and recommendations in the following chapters. But I love to just kind of take a second just because of the opportunities here of, looking at the narrative behind the numbers, right? So pictured here are a few factors. Like Ty's ecosystem did a wonderful job kind of highlighting a few factors that really perpetuate this gender gap of like, wow, why are the numbers so bad, right? So National Girls Collaborative Project, as you saw in the State of Women and Girls in STEM report, as well as this image here, really captures, the gender stereotypes, math anxiety, right? That's real. And this whole narrative about girls not being good in math, that's not true, right? We got to dispel the myths. Looking at male dominant culture, right? And that sense of belonging again, right? They're oftentimes feeling silenced among their male dominant culture here in their workplaces and within their classrooms. And then fewer role models, right? When I was looking up how many women in computer science are living in the area through this database called FabFems, only one came up in my area. Now, maybe some just don't know about this database, but in other, if I were to open it up to men, I'm sure I would get a lot more in my area, right? That could connect to our students and serve as role models for our students. So it's something really interesting. And as again, we'll discuss more barriers and recommendations later, but it's important to note, we want to give girls and women the skills and confidence to move forward in math and science. We want to start early on in early education. So I know I talked a lot about middle school within that pipeline, but elementary STEM is where it's at too. We need to really support girls early on in this pipeline and really work to attract and recruit and retain women of STEM in those fields in colleges and universities as well, and improve our job hiring. We've got lots of web-based packages that talk about this as well, about our hiring practices and retention and what we can do to promote these pathways and have more inclusive cultures. Now, as we saw in some of the data already, computer science is a field that has a large disparity when we're talking about gender and racial disparities in STEM. So I definitely want to take a second as well to highlight some other tools that are my personal favorites. IDRA, we just went over a really great infographic, but IDRA also has a ton of other data dashboards for you to explore. So I just want to highlight that. Code.org is doing fabulous work nationwide, and they also publish amazing reports every year. So I'd like to highlight that tool in a second, as well as CyberStates. I love data visualization, and they have a fantastic interactive data map that covers your region. So it's not, both of these tools are very much not Texas specific, but also for other states within the IDRA EX South regions. But also, hey, leverage your state education agency and their community tools and their folks that work in those data departments. You can also leverage them as well. So I'll go ahead and flip over then to code.org. So code.org has very much like different state level specific data. So you can pull right here. It gives you an overview of different access reports. You can look year by year. You can look by district, by school offerings, by your county. And all of this, like if I were to choose, let's say, let's do Florida, right? If I were to do Florida here, we can look at the specific data for the state, and it's very interactive and very new. Look at the reporting years. This is something that's not outdated. They're doing a great job keeping up with all of this data. And I love, again, data visualization is key, right? And you can really hone in on who's teaching CS, what's being offered in your state, because that's the issue is, was it offered? Yes, but did they close it because enrollment numbers? Well, yes, they also closed it. So they're not actually being taught. So being offered is one thing, but being taught's another. So code.org has done a great job of like teaching all of this in their, computer science advocacy work. So I really strongly encourage you to just go to code.org and pull up your school and pull up your access report. Also, cyberstates.org, they have a wonderful interactive map to explore your tech landscape. So like if we were to choose Louisiana here, it can give me some real data with employment numbers by state. And you can really manipulate this to go even further into your metro areas and even look more closely at your different cities and pops within each area, Mississippi as well. So look at here, 700. I just want to do a quick comparison. I know, Texas is a huge state. We've got some major cities here. 790,000, almost 800,000 tech employment offerings here. We're, ranked number one. And then as we start to move through the South, you can start to see the rankings change with net employment rankings as well and tech job rankings. So, these tools are powerful and they can help communicate the issues happening in your area way better than sometimes we can, right? Through our words. So visuals are key. And, I feel free I have to mention as we're doing a data walk to use the tools that are out there to help paint the picture, right? And tell the story. Going back to labor statistics, STEM is an ever-changing field and we're preparing our students today for even more advanced careers in the future, right? Computing, as noted here, is one of those growing industries that will continue to advance. So computer science, if you want to state the case here for it's a workforce need, it's an industry need, this here is really affirming that, Computing jobs, again, this is from code.org from their website. Computing jobs are the number one source of new wages in the United States. Look at the comparison of all the other fields here. Computing taking the lead, as well as management being a second, right? So this is important as we're talking about and stating the case for computer science and K-12 education and diversity, right? Diversity problem. It's a diversity problem up ahead at career and colleges, but also it begins in K-12. Women who just try AP computer science in high school are 10 times more likely to major in it in college. Black and Hispanic students are 7 times more likely. So if you want to start making a difference later, it starts again in K-12, right? And with our offerings. So we want to make sure we have these course offerings for our students, right? Looking here again, only 34 states, right, have K-12 computer science standards. Texas not being one, right? So we're working at it. We just had some K-8 standards adopted, but they won't be implemented for a while. But learn from each other, right? Like we can learn from Florida. We can learn from other states, Oklahoma, California, of what's happening statewide and what kind of momentum is taking place. But fundamentally, I love this here that, again, family voice is crucial. We talked about the need for counselors and parents and the roles that parents play in influencing students in their trajectory in STEM careers. 90% of parents want their child to study computer science. If we know that parents make a huge, huge difference in STEM trajectories, and they're telling us they want computer science, how come this number is so low, right? Only 45% of high schools actually teach computer science. This needs to change. This needs to change. So it's important to highlight this in this discussion. I also want to highlight Carol Fletcher over at UT Austin and Warner's article here about explaining that, improving equity in computer science education is a systemic process. And it requires a collective action here. It requires all stakeholders to assess and improve the field, right? So this infographic is one of my favorites. It really provides a good summary of the aspects of computer science education that must be considered to achieve better CS equity. I'd like to close this video chapter with some guidance to help you with your future data dives and your own equity audit for your area. Here are some suggestions I'd like to propose as you begin to gather data to help paint a full picture of what's happening in your schools and your STEM programs. So take a data dive to look closely at your district and campus level data. Disaggregate it by race, gender, and special populations, your emergent bilinguals, your first generation students, your students that have special needs, right? Consider all these as you are collecting your materials. And I'd like to help guide you through some indicators to really pay attention to in your own equity audits. Student achievement, right? What are some look-fors? Course passing rates, take a look at those. Grade to grade retention, dropout attrition rates. These are things we want to look at. College readiness. As we think about college and career readiness, what kind of graduation plans are you offering your students, right? If you have an endorsement thing that we have, a bill that we have like here in Texas, we talked about the STEM endorsement. If you have similar endorsement data, find it, collect it, ask your state agency, and they can pull it for you as well if you need support with that. Look at your college preparatory classes here and your courses that you're offering. As we talked about before, the difference that it makes when a student is in an AP course, right? How much more likely they are to turn into those pathways, right? And persist in that pathway. So pay attention to the AP dual credit courses, graduation rates, college entrance exams. These are some examples that you could pull for your own equity audits as it relates to STEM. Same thing, for family engagement, we talk about the importance of families in this conversation, right? Well, what kind of family leadership trainings are you offering? I've had parents come up to me multiple times saying, my child is so interested in STEM, but I just don't know how to support them in that, right? I don't really understand what that even means or what that could look like. So what kind of trainings are you offering your families? And then thinking about family leadership, so beyond engagement, but family leadership, what are the number of families of underserved students that are engaged in your committees on your campus, in your district? Are they a part of designing and advising your equity plans? If families are wanting a course offering, as we saw before, what is happening? What's the process to make that a reality for them? Because we need a place for them to be at the center of the table and driving the discussions that we're having. Climate and culture, as we talked about before, that sense of belonging and interest, right? And especially in a male-dominated field such as STEM, right? So what kind of surveys are you collecting from students, teachers, and families to check in, to serve as a light post of how you're doing with your climate and culture? Restorative justice, implementation data would be super important. So these are some things that you could pull when you're looking at climate and culture. Now, I have to mention as well, a recent webinar, I heard Milani Labat-Joseph talk about, some ideas here, just some conversation starters of how do we really operationalize equity in STEM? Like, how can we do this? What would it look like? And I just love that she talks about, being vigilant about using a racial equity lens in all the work that you're doing and just checking in with yourself daily and asking yourself, does the work that you do maximize the outcomes for youth in their communities? And then also, hey, use your own sphere of influence. Everybody's in different, we're all different stakeholders within this conversation. So use that sphere of influence to advocate and create more true equity in STEM. And you can't do it alone, right? You've got to build a team of change agents to bring about collective action and broaden our impacts in this work. It's important to identify those contributors to STEM equity. So I hope that that's something that we learned from today in this video. And all of this will help us to make data-informed decisions and create goals that can bring about actionable change in our school communities. And so more recommendations will be discussed in the following chapters. This was just to serve as a brief data walk and introduction. You can find more as well, as we talked about all the resources. Go to our website, locate all the tools and resources that we have. And again, thank you. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions or want to talk about any of this further, or if you want to share more up-to-date resources and data or your state's data, I can help guide you a little bit more with your own equity audits. Feel free to reach out. My email's on the screen. Thank you again.